This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
Good afternoon and welcome to this special edition of Left to Black. We are working concurrently today in conjunction with the John Hope Franklin Center and the Wednesday at the Center programming, and we have two special guests with us here today. Activist, hip-hop artist, architect, Omar Offendum, who is to my far right, and directly to my right, we have Freelon, who is a free jazz, hip-hop artist, a member of a group called The Beast, and also an educator. And we're coming today to talk a little bit about the role that hip-hop continues to play and can continue to play in activist movements, particularly looking at some of the things that occurred earlier this year in places like Egypt and Tunisia, but also what we've seen occurring in places like Wisconsin, and of course the Occupy movement all across the world at this particular point in time. Thanks for both of you joining us.
Thanks for having us
today. Let me start with you, Omar. You're Syrian American. Your parents were born in Syria. You moved here when you were a kid. You grew up. You grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. And yet, you know, with all this background and your parents sending you very consciously to Muslim schools, you got caught with the hip-hop bug.
Yeah, definitely.
At a young age. Talk a little bit about how hip-hop had this incredible space in your life when you were growing up.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me on the program. Like you said, my parents were born in Syria. I was born in Saudi Arabia. Immigrated to the D.C. area when I was about 4 years old. Went to these Arabic Muslim schools, or school rather, from 2nd to 12th grade, and that's where we were taught Arabic in conjunction with the local curriculum. And you know, being at that school surrounded by kids from all over the Muslim world, which is literally all over the world, we kind of felt like hip-hop music really spoke to that marginalized section of society that we kind of related to a bit more than perhaps the mainstream, especially when it came to some of the words in the hip-hop lexicon that existed, you know, that were very much influenced by the 5%er ideology and Nation of Islam. And so we'd hear things like Allah, like Muhammad, like break fast, like Ramadan, things like that, and we'd immediately feel kind of drawn to it as a result.
Folks like Rakim, Poor Righteous Teachers,
exactly,
Brand Nubian.
Exactly, yeah, the X-Clan, etc. So it really kind of, it struck a chord with us, and you know, to add to that, poetry is the backbone of the Arabic language, and so whenever you study Arabic, you're inevitably studying poetry, and learning about how tribes were represented publicly by their poets. They even had literally battles going on, just like we do in hip hop, and so to add that layer to it and to start to make those connections was also really exciting for someone like me, growing up.
No, of course, Pierce, you traveled to hip hop in a totally different context. You're in an artistic household. Your father is an internationally known architect. Your mother is an internationally known jazz singer. How did you find yourself coming to hip hop, being exposed to this wide array of not just black cultural expression, but artistic expression in general?
Yeah, well, for me, it only took one listen of Mama Said Knock You Out,
hey,
and I was in. I thought LL was cool, and the music was so powerful. And I was born in 1983. Hip hop was kind of really the underground was on the ascent at that time, and so it all felt very very natural to me. And then as I was coming of age, there was a young MC at the time named Nas who came out, and there's oh my goodness, I mean, Illmatic was such an important album to me, and and again, it kind of gave me a glimpse into a world that I was unfamiliar with in some ways, but also felt very, very intimate and very much like he was speaking to me. So, I think growing up with kind of a diverse exposure of things definitely helped inform the type of music that I make and the man that I am today. But when I was a young buck, like
LL.
LL, you know what I mean? LL Nas, you know, Public Enemy, like, you know, NWA, like there was just so much music that felt unprecedented and had this really crazy sense of just kind of nobody's doing this, and you know, the fact that my parents and grandparents weren't really up on it yet. You know, it was very, you know, it felt very kind of cool to be in that marginalized space with them in terms of appreciating the craft and the culture.
You're watching a special live stream edition of Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, your host. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center as part of their Wednesday at the Center programming. We're joined by rapper, activist, artist, architect Omar Offendum. We're also joined by artist and educator Freelon. Talk a little bit about, you mentioned your parents being disconnected to the music, right? It's something that was your own, but at some point, both of your parents started to have to hear the noise and had to hear some of the language and very descriptiveness of hip hop in terms of, you know, channeling the world into your ears, and then of course through music video. What was your parents', you know, response to this? And of course, you know, it's a more challenging thing with you, Omar, because you're also talking about you embracing a cultural experience that your parents might have also been suspicious of.
Definitely. I mean, you know, to my mother, I always joke about this, but you know, the first time she heard my music, my sister had played it for her at her house. It was like one of the first songs I recorded. I think I was like 17 or 18 at the time. And my mother walks in and she's like, who is this African-American guy rapping about Palestine? And my sister was like, it's your son, you know? So that just showed how far away, you know, the possibility of me even doing something like that was to my mom. And then also when she'd hear the music, you know, to her, the whole concept of looping something, which is just like the very foundation of hip hop, just made no sense to her. She's like, you know, she comes from an era where songs take like 20 minutes to even get started. And yeah, there's no such thing as a loop, you know? So it just sounded like a broken record to her. But once I started to actually create the music myself, and especially when it came to kind of crafting the lyrics, and she saw how much, you know, the ideals and the ideas that she kind of instilled in me as a young and kind of were infused in the music and the lyrics that I was making, she started to support it and appreciate it. Even though she still thinks it sounds like a broken record, but she really appreciates the lyrical content. So that I'm proud of, you know.
Did you ever have to have any conversations? Your mom, of course, is Nina Freelon. Did you ever have to have any conversations with your mom convincing her that hip hop was really art, or did she get it?
I think she got it pretty early on, and partially that was from her experience. So as a jazz vocalist, you know, jazz to her grandmother was the devil's music. That was the bordello jam, you know what I mean? Red Light District, New Orleans, we don't, you know, she came up in a very Christian, like, gospel, you know, she started singing in the choir. So, you know, she dealt with that very same kind of misunderstanding of her craft. So I think she came to hip hop with more of an open mind. Now, she wasn't quite ready to sink her teeth into it, you know, but I think she definitely, because of her experience with her parents, it took her mom even a long time to get used to the fact that she was singing secular music. So, you know, I think, you know, it's not like she was like, you know, like breaking her neck or anything, but like as far as an open mind is concerned, I think she was open to it. Plus, my dad loves Curtis Blow, you know, like, so they're young enough. They had us pretty young, you know.
Break it up,
and that's the most embarrassing. You see, now you're a dad too. You're embarrassing me with that, you know. Like that's the old black man. That's not the new black man. So, you know what I'm saying? But that's my dad. You know, he's the guy, and you know. And also, he's a big James Brown fan, you know, Cameo. Hip hop didn't start with, you know, the seeds were planted in the music that he loved. You know, Gil Scott-Heron. He's the one who put me onto the Last Poets. So he, you know, even though he kind of wanted his distance from the NWAs and some of the, you know, the gangster rap and stuff like that, he understood it, I think.
Let me throw out some names. We mentioned Brand Nubian. Eric B. and Rakim, Poor Righteous Teachers, KRS-One, Boogie Down Productions, Public Enemy, of course, even NWA, Tribe Called Quest. When I mentioned those kinds of acts, besides their musical contribution, what else do you think of them in terms of hip hop, in terms of their importance?
Well, I think what a lot of the artists that you mentioned kind of appeal to that politicized, side of hip hop, that notion of resistance that I think hip hop music can speak to so powerfully and so directly. There was a lot of political music before hip hop started, of course, but the fact that you can cram in that many more words into a song and that much more powerful of a message, and not even have to kind of worry about how you're singing it, just say it, really kind of took it to another level. And the way they did it just felt so natural,
Organic,
and obviously,
right?
Definitely very organic, and they were, kind of products of the communities that they grew up in, and reflections of those communities. And so, when people will kind of give them a bad rep and say, that hip hop is making kids violent, it made no sense to us growing up, because it was the community that they were kind of representing and reflecting off of that was violent. It wasn't, necessarily, guns don't kill people, people kill people kind of thing, So there was that, and then obviously, for some of the other artists you mentioned, like A Tribe Called Quest, for example, which I think on some level even symbolizes this kind of like, I don't want to say softer, but more of like a hippie kind of notion of hip hop to some people, and kind of more of a movement back towards the roots, of African culture and of kind of a global understanding and stuff like that.
And a real embrace of improvisation.
Absolutely, and a real embrace of improvisation, and the beats that Ali Shaheed Muhammad was making, definitely, hardcore, not hardcore, but really strong jazz influence. Kind of had a lot to do with that as well. And so, it just kind of broadened the horizons for somebody like me. And then, even an artist like Big Pun, who was the first Latin rapper to go platinum. He rapped in 2 languages on the album. That meant a lot to me, because I felt like that could kind of then open a door for somebody from the Middle East to perhaps start rapping in Arabic and English as well, which I subsequently started doing, So.
Yeah, I'll just add that to me speaks to a point in hip hop's history where, the artists were really self-determined. You really saw them kind of writing from the heart and writing about things that, really emerged as reflections of their background in the communities that they came from, and really doing what they wanted to do. And I saw that you, posted on Facebook this morning that you were screening Byron Hurt's documentary.
Hip-Hop Beyond Beats and
and there's just a great scene in that movie where he's talking to the young brothers and sisters on the street about what type of music they're allowed to make, because they're going to get signed or not going to get signed based on this finite criteria, this few categories that you're allowed to sing about. And when you mention those names, I just see people who were unhindered by those types of restrictions. They're just going in, they're doing what they love to do. They're writing about their community, and not everybody was on a progressive tip. They were just doing what they wanted to do. And that's so refreshing for an artist to really invest themselves in their craft unconditionally and without reservation. And you don't really see that anymore.
It's, on the one hand,
mainstream,
we could go on and on about the problems with mainstream commercial hip hop right now. We know all the stories. Kanye, even if you could find some place to contextualize a phrase like luxury rap, even if he intended something else, that's all folks heard, in that context, right? And so we understand those dynamics, right? And we understand that folks, are doing what they're trying to do to sell records, to stay on the top of the charts, all those kinds of things. You two have both made choices not to pursue hip hop in that context, right? And the fact that both of you are independent artists, choosing not to go it alone necessarily, right? But to do it in a way in which you're not dealing with kind of the influence of corporations who are just simply trying to sell records, right? I would say in both of your cases, you with the Beast and of course your work, Omar, that you're trying to sell ideas, musical ideas, musical commentary, intellectual commentary, et cetera. What has been the difficulty seeing yourself as an independent artist?
Well, I guess before I speak to the difficulty, I could say the beautiful thing about it is you're just liberated. You don't have those kind of chains holding you down and those expectations from labels and stuff like that.
Yeah, because it always makes you wonder, right? What would Lil Wayne sound like
if he didn't have,
or Lil Kim, right, or Jay-Z, if they didn't have these restraints, right? If they were actually free to say what was on their mind and do it in the style that they wanted to. I think about Q-Tip. you know, Q-Tip goes through his kind of trajectory with Tribe Called Quest, and he does that first solo album, which is the most commercial thing that he's ever done. But then, you know, you get Kamal the Abstract, right? And the ideas are so spread out and diffuse, and you know, it's a free jazz experience, right? But he couldn't sell it, right? Record company didn't know what to do with this, right? You know, how do we play this on, you know, Hot 97? Well, you can't. Yeah, so talk about, go back a little bit, talk about that freedom.
I mean, for me, the thing is with art, I think with all good art, it needs to come from a place of honesty, you know, self-expression that is really rooted in trying to be as truthful as possible to your experience and the experience of your community, et cetera.
And that's not saying that chasing booties isn't something,
absolutely,
you know, that's honest and authentic,
for
but,
sure, that's why it's
but not 24 hours a day.
Exactly, not 24 hours a day, and that's why it seems more natural when some people do it versus some others. You know, it seems like, I don't know why that is necessarily, but you kind of believe it more for some people. Yeah. You know, there's the phrase in hip-hop, keeping it real, and that's really what it comes down to. It's like nobody more than a hip-hop audience knows when an artist on stage is not keeping it real, and they can kind of read through that, see through that, and they're going to boo you right off stage if they don't like you, you know. And so for someone like me, I mean, I'd say my career and the trajectory of my career kind of paralleled the rise of the internet and social networking and being able to capitalize on those tools and being able to kind of create a core fan base around the world. I can't say there's one particular city that I really have a huge, strong following in, but around the world, you know, I've developed thousands of followers who appreciate my music, who understand where I'm coming from, and who have instant access to it because they can just log on and, you know, find it pretty quickly. So I kind of bypassed that whole, you know, thing about trying to get a demo to a label and this and that. I just kind of never even really had to deal with it. But that brought me into different spaces as well. You know, I mean, it's not often that an artist gets invited to a university to perform and to speak, in a class, you know. So, but I appreciate the fact that there is that angle to it and that people can kind of start to understand not just hip hop, but the ideas that I'm kind of infusing into hip hop, you know, within that context as well. So, but the difficulties, I mean, you know, the weird thing about the internet is that it's, you know, your music is out there. So then there's also all those haters and trolls online who are going to be posting all sorts of crazy stuff about you as well, you know. And yeah, and I get the full spectrum, you know, people who think I'm not Arab enough, not Muslim enough, to people think I'm, you know, not American enough and not Western enough. And, you know, you can't worry about that.
I mean, talk a little bit about that, you know, because, you know, Pierce, the work that you do, you know, you're not a hardcore thug, right? I mean, that's not your...
What you trying to say, Dr.
That's not... And so do you ever have to deal with, you know, this dynamic of folks saying to you, you're not hard enough as a way of saying you're not black enough, right?
No, you know, I think... you know, I know a lot of hardcore MCs. There's a lot of them in Durham, and I don't, you know, there's no real kind of tension between my identity because I speak in a voice that's authentic to my experience. I think that's appreciated. Because if I were to come out on some nah meaning, then that would be a problem because they know I'm not a banger.
Pierce making it rain at BU, right?
You know what I mean? Like that's so clearly inauthentic.
Yeah.
And while you know, you were kind of talking about keeping it real, I think the hip hop community at the grassroots level does appreciate realness.
Absolutely.
But you know, the industry on a kind of larger corporate scale, I think they actually appreciate the smoke and mirrors and the fabrication, which is, you know, case in point. That's why Rick Ross is able to, you know, have the background that he has and still kind of convey this really gangster image. You know, he's parole officer Ross.
Right. Working as an essentially working as an ethnographer in prisons and gets all these stories and narratives from that experience. I mean, it's on one level brilliant. Right?
It's great. It is. I think it's very brilliant. But you know, I think
a whole new career path for hip hop.
Right.
You know, start out that way.
You know, gain 50 pounds, take off your shirt, and you got a new career.
You know, and I think that speaks to, you know, the extent to which that kind of corporate level of hip hop, they do kind of appreciate this fantasy, because really, like, selling blackness, corporate selling of blackness, which in this country started with the transatlantic slave trade, has always thrived off of these inaccurate, these untruths, these stereotypes of blackness. Right. That's what's profitable.
I mean, we talk about the original, you know, really commercial stereotypes of black men folks like Bert Williams, later Step and Fetch It, and the irony that their performances were of backward Southern black men. Bert Williams was born in the Caribbean. You know, Step and Fetch It, Lincoln Perry, you know, he's second generation Caribbean here in the United States. Neither one of them had that experience, right? It was not authentic to them, but they could sell that, you know, to a mass public as being authentic, right? And of course, we know what the hip hop story has been the last 30 years. How many of these guys and women have gone to college, grew up in middle class households. You know, we think about someone like Lil Jon, who was a little skateboard kid. You know, one of his parents an engineer, and he's skateboarding around Morehouse and Spelman College. And none of that stuff ever comes up in the music.
Prodigy.
Yeah,
I mean,
Prodigy.
you know,
Prodigy's a great example.
My granddaddy founded Morehouse, you know, but I'm in Mobb Deep, like.
Right, you know, I learned how to play music from guys who played with Ellington. I mean, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Also add to that now the new phenomenon of guys like DJ Khaled, who, you know, originally from the Middle East, but is also selling and pushing this form of music and culture that, you know, I would argue probably had nothing to do with the way he grew up, but, you know, ended up finding that niche and finding that way to speak to that and capitalize on that, you know. And it is very problematic for people like, you know, me to see a brother like him doing that, you know, originally Palestinian. There's so many things he could be doing with
so many things he could be talking about.
With that, you know, with that level, but at the same time, you know, the decisions he makes are his decisions, and he has to, you know, live with them. And he's very comfortable with it, obviously, you know, and people have embraced him. So it's not necessarily like I could sit here and just, you know, talk crap about him all day. You know, he's making decisions, he's doing it on his own, and you can respect his hustle to a certain degree. But at the end of the day, it's about the kind of person you are and the kind of ideas you want to kind of put out there and even allow it to enter you and to internalize. You know, our community or our generation of hip-hop, young hip-hop generation kind of hears an album and almost memorizes it instantaneously after 1 or 2 listens. And so we start to take in all this information, and after a while you start to realize, like, I've got all this stuff in my head, how much of it do I really want to keep in there, and how much of it do I want to start filtering out, you know? And yeah, it takes maturity, I think, to kind of finally get to that level and realize that.
Yeah. You're watching Left of Black. I'm host Mark Anthony Neal. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center, and they're Wednesday at the Center programming. We're joined to my immediate right by Mr. Piers Freelon, artist and educator, here based in Durham, part of a group called The Beast, son of Nina Freelon, the great jazz singer. And to the far right, Omar Offendum, who's a Syrian-American hip-hop artist and activist, architect by training, graduating from the University of Virginia a few years ago. I want to throw like a little narrative out for you as a way to begin to talk about all of the insurgency that we've seen across the globe in 2011. You know, Jay-Z is reportedly worth $400 million, right? And has regularly released albums that top the top of the charts the first week, right? He has, what, 12, 13, you know, #1 CDs, right? Which is the most in music history, right? Great achievement on some level.
Absolutely.
And I always wonder that, what if Malcolm X or Ella Baker, right, would have had access to $400 million? Right. And would have had the kind of access to people's minds and ears the way these figures do, what they would have done with that, right? And it gets to your point about DJ Khaled, you know, the idea that there's so much more that he could be doing, right? And that's really been the criticism, I think, that goes on and on about contemporary hip-hop. You know, say what you want about all the luxury stuff and all the women and the sexism, misogyny, right? And you know, we push back against that stuff, but ultimately when all is said and done, we don't see hip-hop art, contemporary mainstream hip-hop artists really carrying their weight in terms of really talking about what's happening in their communities, what's happening to their communities, right, in the same context. And so we see this explosion of insurgency this year, right, beginning in Northern Africa, quote unquote, the Middle East, places like Tunisia, places like Libya, right, places, of course, like Egypt. And what we find out time and time again is that for young folks, like you mentioned last night in the Sampling Soul class, you know, when you look at the population of folks in Northern Africa and the Middle East, like 60% of them are under the age of 30 years old, right? So of course they're listening to hip hop, right? They've been listening to hip hop all their lives. And when we see hip hop in this context, right, the most political hip hop is always occurring outside of the United States. Right. So talk a little bit about what role you saw hip hop playing in the events that took place January 25, for instance, but also how hip hop played the role for you to be able to communicate a sense of insurgency here in the United States, in Los Angeles, to stuff that was occurring thousands of miles away?
Sure. Well, you know, just to touch on what you were mentioning earlier, you know, I think the question is also, would someone like Malcolm X be able to amass $400 million saying the things that he was saying in this society? Would Jay-Z be where he was if he was saying what he was saying, you know? And then also kind of enter an artist like Lupe Fiasco, who is very much mainstream, but is also saying things like, you know, Glenn Beck is a racist, Limbaugh is a racist, Gaza Strip was getting bombed, Obama didn't say shh, that's why I didn't vote for him, next one either. And he's saying
on the BET Awards,
on the BET Awards with a Palestinian flag wrapped around his microphone, Occupy t-shirt, and Erykah Badu in a burqa behind him singing the chorus. So, yeah, things are changing, you know, but that's 2011 for you, you know. And I think in some ways it's kind of strange to see. I'm kind of worried in the sense that I don't want it to also just become something else that gets commodified and commercialized like everything else in this country. You know, the whole Occupy thing. I hope people don't take it to that level. But I know how genuine people are about really kind of wanting to see a change and how much they were inspired by what was taking place in the Middle East and North Africa and how that has influenced them and their ideas and the things that they choose to rally around and galvanize around here in the U.S. as far as the Occupy movements are concerned here. But you know, hip hop speaks to the younger generation in the Middle East and North Africa. It's still not mainstream, but it's inching closer and closer towards that. More and more mainstream, quote unquote, stations and radio stations are starting to play it, are picking up on it. They're understanding that it is speaking very much to the youth, very directly. And I mentioned something yesterday that I think was very important, was about how it's empowering not just for the listener, but for the person who's making it as well, you know.
Which is what Gil Scott-Heron would have said, right?
Absolutely.
Right, that he got something out of producing this music
exactly
beyond simply making some money if he could and things like that, right?
Yeah, it's the spiritual fulfillment and gratification, you know, that kind of mental gratification, emotional gratification. When you live in a society that is dealing with so much censorship, you know, both self-censorship because of, you know, the communities and the parents and expectations, and then also obviously the governmental censorship about things that you can and cannot say. You know, something like hip-hop can really kind of shatter that whole notion. The best example is this young brother named El General. He goes by the name El General. He's a Tunisian MC. And in December, he put out a song called Reis al-Blad, the president of the country, Mr. President kind of thing. And he's, you know, just going hard, you know, going in all the way on all the corruption and all the bribery and nepotism and problems of the society, and kind of tying it all back to the leader there. And this happened before Ben Ali was ousted in Tunisia. And he ended up going to jail because of the song, and spent a few days in jail, and people kind of rallied around him to get him out of jail and things like that. And, you know, that was one of the many things that kind of really pushed the revolution forward. So hip-hop played a big role from very early on in these kind of movements. And now every single revolution around the region has its kind of hip-hop anthems alongside all the traditional cultural call and response chants and music that come out naturally in that region as well. And it's a really beautiful thing to see. I mean, every time I log on to Facebook, there's a new young MC so-and-so from somewhere in the region who's telling me that they've heard my stuff and they enjoy it. To bring it back here, for someone like me, you know, when we put out the song January 25th, for example, hashtag Jan25, was a song that featured me, Iraqi-Canadian rapper The Narcissist, Amir Suleiman, Def Poetry Jam, African-American, phenomenal spoken word artist, Freeway, who is, you know, well known for
Philadelphia
his,
Freeway.
Philadelphia Freeway, Philly Freezer, Team Early. Early. You know, African-American brother from Philly, Muslim. His manager was Egyptian, and so, you know, he kind of
signed to Rockefeller, right?
That's right. Known for his tenure on Rockefeller Records. He's on Rhymesayers now, I think. But basically, you know, it was a song of solidarity more than anything, you know, and also the lyrics that I put into it, and many of the other artists as well, kind of were meant to tie it into the global struggle for peace and justice, and to kind of really frame it within that context, to say, yeah, it's happening in Egypt, but, you know, even on Amir Suleiman's verse in the song, he mentions how we got to take this to Wall Street, you know, and sure enough, a few months later those connections were starting to be made, and you know, and it happened. And so it's a beautiful thing to see that kind of consciousness kind of really starting to take root in the younger communities here in the United States, and understanding that decisions that are made in places like Wall Street and K Street and the White House affect the lives of millions of people around the world, and in turn then affect the way that Americans are perceived, you know? And so this whole notion of, you know, why do they hate us? It's like, look, there's plenty of reasons why people are upset about American foreign policy if you just take the time to read it and understand it. So, yeah.
Appears you were just in West Africa.
Yeah.
Did you see a lot of hip-hop circulating there?
Oh, man. I mean, hip-hop is African.
Yeah.
Like, it was all over the place. But, you know, I was in a club. There's an artist, one of the pioneers of West African hip hop, specifically Ghanaian hip hop, which they call hip life.
Hip life, yep.
There's a guy named Reggie Rockstone.
Yeah.
Reggie, I interviewed him in 2007. A lot of my graduate research was based on hip life. He owns a club in Accra called The Office. And we went there. We went to the office. We partied with Reggie. He bought shots for everybody. He's a great host. But then his DJ, this was really surprising. Packed club, great vibe. His DJ was spinning a bunch of like radio top 40 hits. You know, it was basically spinning, you know, locally K97.5, top 40 pop, Drake, Lil Wayne, whatever.
Right.
And everybody knows
Nicki
all the
Minaj,
lyrics.
right. Yeah.
Like everybody in there. Like, I'm on one, just like, you know, the drop the beat. I'm on. Everybody knows all the lyrics, and that kind of surprised me. Just because, I mean, it shouldn't have, because I know how global hip hop is, and, you know. But these corporations that kind of own the media outlets, there ain't but a couple stations in West Africa. They got 10 channels, like really like 3 channels, you know, because half of them are fuzzy anyway. And it's the same stuff that you see on MTV and these other stations. Their monopoly on media is completely global. It's global, and it's comprehensive. So yeah, but you know, there's a lot of underground MCs in Ghana and West Africa too. So I think a lot of their introduction to it is this very kind of through these mainstream avenues. But there are things in the culture and in the music that they can identify with and then reinterpret in their own voices. So I did very much see a lot of underground MCs. There's a cat named A+, very similar to the brother you talked about, El General. He put out an album called A Letter to Parliament, and it was the same thing. He got in trouble with the current regime that was in power. There was some law issues. He got jailed, but you know, he's in here emceeing about Parliament and Ghana and corruption and a lot of the different things. So, you know, you can kind of see them, the Ghanaians, really seeing something familiar in the culture. And even though it might be kind of sterilized and corporate when they first see it, they can take from that and then reinterpret it in an organic, you know, Ghanaian voice.
Yeah.
You know.
I'm going to show my age now.
Ha.
So, you know, for me, growing up and becoming an adult, being in college, the definitive political moment for me were the protests against South African apartheid. I mean, that defined my time in college in the mid-1980s. Jesse Jackson running for president for the first time. I have not sensed that kind of political urgency, insurgency, if you will, until I've been watching and trying to interpret the Occupy movement. We clearly hadn't seen this in the United States in some time. We saw early elements of it in Wisconsin with state workers back in February and March. And it was an interesting kind of moment, right? Because you basically were looking at white working class people in the Midwest who clearly were taking signals from North Africa and the Middle East, right? And were expressing solidarity with that movement in ways that, you know, in some ways is really confounding, right? And of course we have this large corporate media structure that, you know, in the absence of knowing what to do with these images, simply choose not to present them at all. And even in the context, you know, you have NFL players who are being locked out who are also showing solidarity. You know, it's an interesting kind of moment, and then Occupy explodes, right? And Occupy, of course, you know, if there's something that, you know, connects it all, you know, folks talk about the kind of lack of color in the Occupy movement. Though I was in Baltimore this past weekend, and Baltimore occupies like 70% black, right? Speaking to what that city is. I think it's not unusual that, you know, the police have moved in places like Baltimore and Oakland where there is a heavy component, you know, of black bodies in those spaces. But, you know, the one thing that you see time and time again is that these are folks all under the age of 30, largely white. Many of them both middle class, even upper middle class, and highly educated, right? And what happens when you get these generation of folks, and I could be talking to Duke students right now, who have gone to all the right schools, have made all the right decisions, have made all the right connections, and you come out and find out that there's no job there for you to sustain your investment in this American dream that was always going to be impossible for you to connect to anyway.
Right.
So as the two of you are traveling around the world and traveling around the country, you know, how does the Occupy movement speak to you personally, but also to your art at this particular point in time?
Well, you know, yeah, it's not just that they're recognizing the fact that they've made all the right decisions and can't find a job, but they also recognize the fact that there's people at the top of these power structures who are making bazillions of dollars in bonuses.
Bazillion.
You know?
Right, and we
so,
talked about this last night. You know,
yeah.
in some place like Egypt, you know, they could look directly, right, or Libya, right?
Yeah.
They could look directly at the Gaddafi family and the Mubarak family and go, okay, it's them,
Yeah.
right? United States, it's so much more diffuse, right? If the head of, say, Time Warner walked into the room right now, no one would know who he was,
Not
right?
at all, yeah.
We'd know all the celebrities that he pays, you know, or the board pays and that kind of. But you know, these are folks that we don't see. You know, we know Steve Jobs,
Right.
right? We know those. You know, we know those kinds of folks, but you know, we don't see those folks in the same way.
Yeah, and in a place like the Middle East, you know, you see them because they roll in with a, you know, black tinted Mercedes stretched thing, and there's like 30 dudes around them, and so there's no mistaking who
Right,
the person is.
right. That's the H in NIC,
Yeah, and
right?
it's so the gap between rich and poor is so much more in your face there,
Yeah.
you know. But it's starting to happen here. You know, the more that homes get foreclosed, the more that communities get gentrified, the more that people start to recognize, you know, and start to make the, you know, connect the dots as far as where, you know, all the source of all these problems is starting to stem from.
And the dysfunctionality of the political process.
Obviously,
right?
yeah, that too, you know, and being fed up with the fact that, you know, it takes Congress forever to make any decisions, if they even do make them. And, you know, the people who supposedly represent Republicans, you know, many of the people in the Tea Party are, you know, disgusted with the same thing with many of the Democrats and people who think that they're spineless and this and that. And so you have this finally happening in the U.S. where people are, you know, waking up, shaking up, and we can't act like we're just this island that's disconnected from the rest of the world in reality, you know. When Wall Street crashes, the rest of the world does, you know. And so I think the younger people are starting to recognize that just as much as, you know, them not having the opportunities, but also seeing how much it affects the rest of the world, how much that ties into the military-industrial complex that we've established here in the U.S., how the thousands of military bases around the world, you know, symbolize empire to the rest of the world. And, you know, it's so much more of the globe is shrinking. A lot of that has to do with the internet, you know, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we can kind of connect with people thousands of miles away in an instant. And yeah, I've been all over, you know, I was in Melbourne, Australia last weekend, and they had just started Occupy Melbourne there, and for a lot of the same reasons, and a lot of the same slogans and banners you see at all these places. Now, each one is unique in terms of its, you know, how it affects the people on a local level, but on a global scale, a lot of them are talking about the same issues of, you know, not wanting to go to these ridiculous wars and these great lengths to kind of fund these wars.
And that 1%, 99% formula
Absolutely,
gets
yeah.
reproduced time and time again, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's, you know, that's how you build a hierarchy. Right?
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point yesterday, you know, how about the 1%. It's like somebody like Kobe Bryant might be considered part of the 1% when you look at his tax bracket.
But he didn't start there.
But he didn't start there, and it's that person who's, you know, signing his checks that's really that 1%, you know, and that who we wouldn't know if he walked in the room,
what does the 1% of the 1% look like? Right. You know, those are the folks that we want to see, right? Those are the folks, those are the names that we want.
You mentioned the lockout. You know, I saw something really interesting the other day. I did not expect at all, but Brian Gumbel on his show went in pretty hard on David Stern.
And called him a plantation owner.
Called him a plantation owner. Yeah, and yeah, I was just blown away. Not just because it was the things he was saying, but because it was Brian Gumbel. You know? Yeah, it was like, wow.
Right.
So
Brian, he got black. Right? When did that happen?
Just for a second.
Just for a second.
But for a lot of the same reasons, you know. I think, you know, the complaints and the grievances that he had were similar to some of the things that people are saying, you know, as far as exploiting and, you know. Yeah.
What are you seeing, Pierce?
Yeah, I see it kind of as a really kind of interesting time. I think that historically there are times when kind of revolutions can kind of reach a peak, and I think the global, you know, like now with social networking, we're able to communicate in kind of unprecedented ways. I think that it's no surprise that that's kind of at an all-time high while these revolutions are kind of sprouting around. And what I've been thinking a lot about is the Haitian Revolution and how that catalyzed all these other revolutions. Some big, like the French Revolution, some Small like the Nat Turner Revolution, completely inspired by Toussaint Louverture, what was happening in Haiti.
A totally different moment of social media.
Yeah, exactly. But equally unprecedented for the time.
Absolutely.
You know, the colonies they're connected in a way that was completely unprecedented. The world was getting smaller. I mean, imagine, you know, the three of us of their time sitting around talking about how, like, oh man, the levels of communication between countries, everything, the world is getting smaller. So I think we're also technologically at a point now where the world is getting much smaller with social networking and everything else. And you have this stuff happening in, you know, in Africa and in the Middle East. And it's something that people identify with and resonates with them on a global scale. And to me, I kind of feel like it feels great to be kind of tapped into the pulse because, you know, Malcolm X said, you know, if you don't know what's happening in I forget what cities he used, it might have been like Zimbabwe and like, you know, like some southern city where some Jim Crow is going down. But, you know, if you don't know what's happening in Birmingham, you don't know what's happening in Zimbabwe, you know, kind of trying to tether that. So there are people who have always seen those connections, but now I think like a larger mass of people are able to see how we're all kind of connected, and I think that's helped catalyze these movements around the world, and that's really exciting to me because I think there's unprecedented power and potential in that global movement because, you know, isolated things, you know, it's harder to really pop off from that, so.
You're watching Left to Black. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center as part of their Wednesday at the Center programming. We're joined by Omar Offendum, activist, hip-hop artist, architect, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Also by Freelon, who of course is an educator and a jazz artist, hip-hop artist, if you will, here located in Durham, but of course doing your work all around the world. Also, you can follow the conversation on Twitter at Left of Black and also at Duke Live. You can follow Omar Offendum at simply at Offendum. You can follow Pierce Freelon simply at The Beast Music, and you can follow me at New Black Man.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.